Well, with a new ban list comes the dividing line, in a sense, for a new format. At least that would have been the case if the ban list the TCG received at the end of March was one of meaningful substance. Sadly, it does not appear that way at the moment. Therefore, one should not expect any real change in the meta as a result of the new ban list, but one should expect a change in the meta somewhat with the release of Maximum Crisis and the new Dinosaur Structure deck. Right now it is rather easy to identify the top decks in the game, so a top 10 best deck lists of this format is rather moot when at least 8 of the 10 decks are basically the same among all player and commentator lists. So I'm going to do what has almost become tradition in a sense on this channel, a top 10 list of the best non-meta or rogue deck entering the new format. First, this list is comprised of my analysis of how a particular deck competes against the top tier decks in the coming format, and as a form of tiebreaker, how the decks compete against each other. Overall, the list does not just take into account decks that are tier 1 now, but how the meta will change over time, including with the release of Crisis, the Dinosaur Structure deck, and, to a very small extent, Code of the Duelist, although the prospects of the Link system only had limited influence. So with that said, for the purpose of this list, Tier 1 decks were thought to be Paleozoics, Zodiacs, Invoked Windwitch, Infernoid, Dinosaur, True Draco, more than likely the pure version that kind of spams out Masterpiece, and some form of True King, more than likely hybridized with Yang Zing. However, it is worth noting that Infernoids did have less influence on the ranking than the other Tier 1 decks because the release of Ghost Ash in Maximum Crisis should have a significant negative effect on its competitiveness and standing as a Tier 1 deck. I also elected not to include very recent Tier 1 decks, notably ABC, Blue Eyes, PK Fire Burning Abyss, Cosmos, DDDs, Metaphors with its various hybrids, and Mermail, because it's difficult for me to think of a deck that was recently Tier 1 as almost immediately falling to quote-unquote rogue status. Taking note of the question mark regarding the standing of the Lightsworn Minerva Zombie Shiranui deck, I really do not regard this deck as genuine Tier 1, for in my eyes it is just a deck that largely hopes to sack the opponent with That Grass Looks Greener, and right now is simply riding the wave of hype. Fortunately, I can somewhat discard it as a contender for this list in my opinion, and as a deck to weigh contenders against, because in my opinion when Ghost Ash comes out in Maximum Crisis, the deck will have some major problems. Unlike Infernoids, who can survive Ghost Ash somewhat, largely because Infernoids are quality, and because Void Feast is just such a beast of a card, this crazy, kind of sacky hybrid probably will not survive Ghost Ash. Interestingly enough, I believe that Zombie Shiranui on its own is a rather quality deck, and would have been placed high on the list. Spoiler alert, I had it at number 2, just like the last list, except I wanted to avoid confusion between pure Zombie Shiranui and this Lightsworn hybrid, so I did not include either. Overall, I believe Shiranui will definitely survive in the coming months along with its zombie friends, but will cast off the Lightsworn elements. So, with that, let's get started. Number 10. LUNALIGHT. So, Lunalights have fallen from 9 to 10 since the last best rogue deck list. What happened? Well, the strengths of Lunalights remain the same, pertaining to its general aggressive strategy, with advantage generators in Sheep, Rabbit, and Tiger, setting up fusion plays, in addition to Rabbit's quasi-giant Trunade effect to temporarily eliminate back row threats, Wolf's piercing and secondary fusion support, and Blue Cat is still directing traffic with regards to the coup de grace. Support by both Tenki as a searcher and their own personal high-quality revival card in Perfume. Despite the deck being fusion-centric, it can commonly retain significant resources after fusion play to make follow-up plays. From a defensive standpoint, both Blue Cat and Cat Dancer protect the field well enough. Also, Zodiacs provide some nice hybridization opportunities, increasing the destruction efficiency of the deck by providing an easier way to remove battle-immune monsters, as well as providing a meaningful speed boost. Unfortunately for Lunalights, general problems also remain, for both Cat and Panther Dancer can have trouble against some of the bigger fields that opponents can put together, and cannot do much against a field lacking monsters in contrast to other big power OTK decks like Fluffles and Mermails. While not a big influence on the list, the arrival of Link Summoning will do Lunalights no favors, and while some would argue that there are still powerful Lunalight combos under Link Summoning, almost all of them now require 3 or 4 cards instead of just 1 or 2 cards, which is a big deal when it comes to consistency. Also, a number of them require Yugioh Chick, which is not out in the TCG. However, the biggest problem for Lunalights is the change in the meta. For example, Zodiacs is not a strong matchup, as Tridents can hit your combo pieces that attempt to maximize combo efficiency, Whiptails stop attacking combos in their tracks, and the ever-present fear of Dimensional Barrier, not just for Zodiacs but for basically every other deck, can completely shut down your turn. Paleo is another troublesome matchup, with Totally Awesome Negation, Sky Cavalry neutralizing battle rushes, and various trap cards causing slowdowns to anything not named Leo Dancer. And finally, what does Lunalight do against a card effect destruction immune Crystal Wing? Basically pray to draw a defensive tech card. While the arrival of Zodiac Laika in Maximum Crisis will help explosiveness in addition to Kalido whenever that comes out, neither card addresses a lot of these problems in the current meta deck. They just increase the overall explosiveness of Lunalight, but they don't really give Lunalights this technical advantage that can supersede other decks' strengths. Number 9. Melodious Shinobird. On the last list, Melodious almost made the top 10 because of its potential against the existing and possible future meta at the time: ABC, Blue Eyes, Burning Abyss, Frog Heroes, etc. Because of the rather easily achievable and frequently recursive anti-targeting and anti-battle destruction soft locks with ARIA. When special summoned, ARIA's effect makes this deck a pain in the neck to deal with, for most decks only have a small handful of outs. In addition, in Fusion variant, Schuberta's Graveyard Banish effect can interrupt opponent playmaking, limiting their overall efficiency, while hiding behind ARIA and then dealing out some punishment as a 2400 to 3000 attack point hitter that cannot be targeted or destroyed by battle. Heck, it was even possible for Melodious to win via deck out by simply stalling out for 20 plus turns. However, the biggest problem with Melodious then, and still is, by itself in a pure version, was inconsistent attack flows, which provided opportunities for opponents to remove ARIA because Melodious just couldn't do significant damage. For just sitting on an ARIA has its problems. Cough, Kaiju's cough. While the opponent then could build resources to flash OTK after removing the ARIA. So why are Melodious on this list if they missed the last one and almost nothing has changed within their own deck? For Ostinato, their huge new trump card, is still not out in the TCG. Well, as one can infer from the title of this number, since the last list, Melodious can now partner up with a friend that fills the offensive deficiency quite well, whereas Melodious compensates for this friend's lack of defense. Enter Shinobird. Shinobirds and Melodious together in the proper build can be a nasty combination, with Shinobirds handling the offense by using Baron and Baroness to pressure the OTK, and at worst push negatives, and Melodious, backed by ARIA, doing a quality job at providing an effective defensive barrier, much more so than a few tokens. A well-designed Shino Melodious deck puts the opponent almost in a sense on an uncomfortable clock, which nicely limits the detriment of the Kaiju problem for the defensive capacities of Melodious. Number 8. Super Heavy Samurai. If Super Heavy Samurai Daihachi was available in the TCG, then Super Heavy Samurai would have placed higher on this list, for Daihachi is a fantastic piece of support for the deck, significantly increasing consistency and versatility, as all searchers are wont to do. However, the new arrival of Soul Peacemaker is good enough to produce the level of versatility necessary to get Super Heavy Samurai a spot on the list, for Peacemaker working in combination with Soul Piercer and Scales gives the deck a huge speed and consistency boost. A quality baby kaiju hybridization pairs well, for kaijus eliminate annoying high-quality monsters like various invoked fusions, Masterpiece, True Dracos, Indestructible Crystal Wings, Totally Awesome, and even lesser extent Tridents. Kaijus also create an effective synchro summoning synergy with a Battle Ball, while Benkai and his other allies run through everything else, dodging the stray Mirror Force variants. The level of innate special summoning in this deck is also rather high and helps it play through various interruption plays by the opponent, again bolstered by Peacemaker. It has some strong defensive options, both in Archetype in Giga Gloves and Prep Defense, and generic in various hand traps, along with Swift Scarecrow. Also, there are a couple of interesting tech monsters for the deck that can further help Super Heavy Samurais win the day. Finally, even Super Heavy Samurai Thief has actually become a lot better at its job of late in stealing your opponent's back row resources. Obviously, the biggest issue for Super Heavy is the almost utter lack of spell and trap resources to provide playmaking support and defense, but with the small slowdown coming with Link Summoning, the detriment of this lack of speed and trap access will be reduced slightly. Overall, the difference between this list and last list was Peacemaker, and as previously mentioned, while the deck is better now than a lot of people think it is, because it's kind of one of those decks a lot of people have just forgotten about, when Daihachi is released, this deck could be one heck of a black sheep contender. Number 7. Odd Eyes Magician. Odd Eyes Magicians are in an interesting place in the game, for while they are much more dangerous than most people give them credit for, largely because of deck design that focuses too much on min-maxing versus consistent playmaking, they will receive a meaningful power boost in the near future, opening the door to even more power plays, regardless of whether one wishes to go the Zark route or not. The release of Magician's Left Hand and Magician's Right Hand alone will take this deck to another level of annoyance and power, and Duelist Advent will provide a huge versatility boost for the deck. The new Pendulum Graph cards are also coming boons to the deck, providing more searching and destruction in addition to Startime Magician. However, right now, even before getting these new toys, Odd Eyes have lots of versatility with powerful fusions, Synchronex Z playmaking, in addition to numerous destruction methods, including the standard bearers, Dragon Pit, and Dragon Pulse. In the future, Link Summoning does not hurt this deck nearly to the level as most other Pendulum decks, in addition to other extra deck reliant decks, thanks to cards like Oath Dragon and Amazing Pendulum, in addition to more generic card support. While the future may look bleak for some Pendulum decks and other extra deck based archetypes, Odd Eyes Magicians should only get stronger as the months pass relative to most of these other decks. Number 6. Darklord. Darklords have had an interesting road since receiving their newest support in Destiny Soldier last year. Initially, there was a lot of hype surrounding this archetype, with some commentators and players declaring it one of the top decks in the meta right when it came out, a belief that was thought to be justified when it netted 2 top 32s at YCS Anaheim. However, since that breakout, the fate of Darklords have flipped, and a number of players have simply forgotten them, as they have done little since. This somewhat radical perception is unfortunate, for Darklords is a rather solid deck when designed properly. The strengths of Darklords are above average speed, with the right cards producing significant resources, the ability to rapidly swarm the field with big bodies that have the capacity to OTK and remove opponent monsters rather effectively, and the ability to shut down the capacity of the opponents to produce counterattacks if he or she is still standing after the assault, through the ability to sacrifice life points instead of resources via activating certain traps from the graveyard, providing a strong defense, interrupting the opponent's plays, as well as shutting down special summoning if you choose to go that route. Overall, in my opinion, the deck plays better as a control deck, though, than an all-in swarm OTK deck or a cheap drop Vanity's Fiend deck to shut down your opponent's monster playmaking. But since most players seem to play it on one of those latter choices, the quality control elements within this deck receive less respect than they should. Obviously, the biggest problem for Darklords is consistency, because both similar to Monarchs, the deck naturally consists of a lot of high-level monsters, and that only one copy of each second-generation Darklord can be special summoned during a single turn. Another smaller but still meaningful concern is that while Darklord monsters as a whole do have large attack and defenses, they do not have a single monster that exceeds 3,000 attack, and the two that hit that mark cannot be special summoned, which makes it difficult for the deck to consistently hit over certain big monsters, forcing them to rely on other removal means. Overall, as previously mentioned, when designed properly, Darklords are a solid deck that can play the resource game, control game, and or explosion game well during the same duel, giving it an edge against a number of decks. Number 5. Satellar Knight. I have said it before, and I'm going to say it again here. The fall off of Satellar Knights in the competitive environment is still one of the biggest mysteries to me in Yu-Gi-Oh! I guess the reason for this fall off was the general change in play strategy where making a super board became first priority, and while the super board mentality has somewhat given way, it's given way to a kind of super plus mentality brought on by Zodiacs. The fact that Satellar Knights can't make super unbreakable boards or go +5 or 6 in a single turn has seemingly turned off a lot of people from the deck. Instead, the strength of Satellar Knights remain in their smaller but continuous and multiple pluses, which they receive both from their main deck monsters and their extra deck monsters, and the ability of those extra deck monsters to control the field and pull the duel into a grind state, which Satellar Knights prefer. The release of Batlamus fixed one of their biggest weaknesses in the lack of a 2-material rank 4 XZ monster that could function as a Satellar Knight, and even expanded the power play by allowing for it to evolve into a Deltaros or Trever. The deck construction is loose enough that it can side easily, and due to the effectiveness of the monsters, veteran players know how it can turtle itself behind various back row, including behind the best counter trap in the game, Stellar Nova Alpha. The biggest problem facing these guys is the level of available negation, reducing the overall impact of Deneb, and stuffing the XZ plays. Overall, this deck would have placed higher if Solemn Strike and Dimensional Barriers were limited, because outside of Counter Trap negation and Dimensional Barriers blanket you can't play this certain way effect, the deck can be designed in a way to effectively handle Spell Speed 2 based negation and destruction, to maintain field control and produce pluses. Another problem is the issue of monsters versus back row. For most Satellar Knight decks tend to run a smaller than average monster count, and Paleozoic preparation using cards like Danko, Jinzo, Wiretap, and even Royal Decree can hurt the efficiency of Satellar Knight in a collateral damage side deck type manner. Another thing I think hurt Satellar Knight play was too many players overvalued the ability or the usefulness, or basically in a sense the essentialness, of 3 copies of Rhoda, and simply overreacted to the general consistency and playmaking capacity of the deck when Rhoda was limited to 1. While Rhoda at 3 certainly helps the deck, that is without question, to think that the deck is dead solely because Rhoda is at 1 is improper thinking. Number 4. Fluffle. Over the course of their existence, Fluffle has been one of the most hot-cold decks in the game. Some swear that Fluffles are on the cusp of greatness, breaking through that Tier 1 status, whereas others just look at Fluffles as generally unfulfilled hype that gets way too much support that should be passed over to other decks. Since the last list, the strengths of Fluffles have only increased with the addition of Penguin and Kraken within the archetype, and the addition of generic Foolish Burial Goods as a quasi-Rhoda. Fluffle players are also holding out hope that FRIGHTFUR Patchwork will be released sometime in the near future. Most are looking at May, further making this deck more consistent and fast. Overall, Fluffles can still go 5 to 10 cards deep in this deck thanks to Wings, has high power field destruction in the form of Tiger, with negation sidestepping via Cat, Rabbit, and now Penguin, while grabbing advantage when those Fluffles are sent to the graveyard. FRIGHTFUR Sheep is still able to control the field well enough and is an effective negator against Whiptail interference. Kraken has basically replaced Wolf as the chief damage dealer for the OTKs, and with Link summoning on the horizon, SABRE-TOOTH has become even more important at maintaining Fluffle relevance. Unfortunately, Link summoning will be significantly detrimental to Fluffles in reducing its overall speed and combo efficiency, as well as now, until something is done about it on the ban list, it seems like everybody is main decking or side decking Dimensional Barrier, which kind of turns Fluffles off for the turn. That fusion issue also is still a meaningful problem for the deck even when Patchwork comes out. If your polymerization is neutralized in some fashion or you don't get it, it is incredibly hard to come back with this deck, for the main deck monsters cannot really hold their own against the monsters produced by other meta decks. Also, the meta matchups are a little trickier than previously for this deck due to the increased negation, increased interruption, and the increased graveyard interference from Infernoid, and everybody more than likely eventually going to side that new and improved Necro Valley. Despite these problems, Fluffles tend to come out more ahead than behind, for they still have a lot of things going for them. Draw power, searching, fusion recursion, destruction effect, effect neutralization during the damage step, and anti-destruction field control. Number 3. Electromagnet Warrior. To those who predicted this one, give yourself a cookie. I'll just repeat what I have always said about this deck. It is one of those tricky don't judge a book by its cover deck, for while initially it may not look like much on paper, after playing it for a while, one realizes how dangerous the deck is, regardless of the opposing deck. With the ability to drop both a Gorgonic Guardian and an Empyrean in the same turn, the deck can produce solid boards that, even when broken, produce significant levels of follow-up. The overall level of versatility of this deck, when designed appropriately, is high quality, having the ability to drop powerful effect monsters in Berserkion, powerful fusion monsters, strong XZ monsters, and even quality synchro monsters. The overall efficiency and versatility of this deck rivals a number of more celebrated decks. Let us also not forget about Magnetic Field, one of the more annoying field spells in the game for the opponent, in its ability to consistently net multiple pluses, thanks to the on-summons effect of Electromagnet Warrior monsters, as well as its ability to effectively remove on-field threat in a non-destruction or non-targeting manner. When the new Link rules hit the game this coming summer, the ability to access a monster like Berserkion and or Block Dragon, in addition to the field presence this deck can create, will help accelerate this deck past other top decks that cannot adjust well, even more so than it is now. An interesting element of this deck is that while a card like Quasar always seemed to garner respect, few people tend to recall that Empyrean is probably a better card overall, for if the opponent does not have a kaiju to deal with it, they will eventually lose 90+% of the time due to its floating and negation effect. Overall, I think the biggest problem for Electromagnet Warriors was simply it got overshadowed by ABCs. It's one of those decks that just slipped through the cracks and people tended to forget about it, which is rather sad, for when designed properly and run by an experienced player, this deck can throw down, so to speak. Number 2. CARDIAN. Back when I did a deck profile on CARDIAN, my general analysis was while CARDIANs can do some nice things now, the deck's overall play capacity would skyrocket after Raging Tempest because they would pick up some incredible support in Light Flare, Recardnation, and Cherry Blossom, not only giving them more power play, but an insane boost in consistency. Well, Raging Tempest has come and gone, and it's time to appreciate how good CARDIANs are in the current meta. Good CARDIAN decks incorporating the Raging Tempest support will commonly go 8 to 15 cards deep on the first turn and can OTK or quasi-OTK the opponent more often than not. What I mean by quasi-OTK is lower the opponent to 1500 or less life points with a light shower on the field. They can also frequently overwhelm numerous negators or interrupters in a turn when drawing decent, making them a good, solid go-second deck. Also, with the timely departure of Vanity's Emptiness, the auto-lose card for CARDIANs, because an optimized CARDIAN deck really has no way of removing Emptiness, going second is even less of an issue now. While some may be turned off by the general lack of main deck power with the monsters topping out at 2000 attack, Cardians have more than enough tricks up their sleeve in their monster effects, like Cherry Blossom from the hand increasing attack power, along with the non-targeting removal from Boar and Deer, in addition to their synchros, especially Light Flare. A Light Shower can also be a pain in the neck time bomb. With all of this going for them, Cardians are not really even at full power yet in the TCG, for it still lacks Tsuki Hanayami, which is a nice linker synchro monster that provides even more increased consistency. Not surprisingly, the one major weakness is rather obvious. Cardians can certainly brick from time to time, but thanks to the new support from Raging Tempest, bricking is much less probable now than it previously was. Interestingly, Cardians are one of the only decks in the game that can go from turn 1 brick to turn 2 OTK your opponent. Also, it is important to have a proper side deck to address the cancerous, horribly not fun Vanity's Emptiness on Legs decks that, like those that use Vanity's Fiends and Barrier Statue, that you will unfortunately encounter from time to time. However, it is also important to note that another possible weakness to Cardians is that it is a rather brainy deck, in that while learning the basics is rather easy, there is a significant gap between understanding the deck and mastering it due to certain ways to stack the deck and how to order effect activation. Thus, there is always the looming threat of the misplay reducing win probability. Overall, though, for those committed to the deck, any detriments born from misplay should not be much of a problem. Before I get to the number 1 deck, I want to talk briefly about some decks that are not on the list and why. First, I was on the Chain Burn train much faster than most others, demonstrated when I discussed it on my last list. So, why is Chain Burn not on this list when a number of other players and commenters are now so high on it due to its Zodiac matchup? The simple answer is that Chain Burn can really only thrive against an unprepared player, and in the current incoming meta, unfortunately for Chain Burn enthusiasts, it should see itself sacrificed in a sense upon the altar of side deck collateral damage as players start to side more and more against Paleo, and cards that commonly stop Paleo stop Chain Burn as well. Even if most players don't side in this manner, instead continuing to focus on Zodiacs, smart play by good duelists tend to give Chain Burn enough problems. Second, no barrier statues on this list. For one, I simply hate the concept of the deck, and two, it is ridiculously easy to side against, making the success of the deck almost entirely contingent on facing an unprepared or unskilled opponent. When one of the primary match win criteria for a deck is, my opponent needs to be completely taken by surprise and unprepared for my deck, it is difficult to take that deck seriously as a high-quality deck. Overall, if barrier statues ever become popular, it would disappear almost immediately, in my opinion, under the assault of prepared side decks. Necros, it certainly is not. Finally, while it is not on the list because the deck does not come out until Maximum Crisis, I feel it is important to give an honorable mention to Spiral Mythic Radiant Dragon, for if this list were focused only on after Maximum Crisis, it would definitely have been on the list. While it does not have enough support to be run as a pure archetype, pairing it with Paleozoics is rather effective, for Paleo does a nice job of carrying the deck when needed, and Spiral Mythic does a nice job of clearing a lot of the counters that opponent will use against Paleos, especially those with legs. One may argue that the deck on paper appears slow, but in actual play the deck is quick enough and provides such an effective level of control that despite the inability of the deck to produce +3, +4, +5s, etc., the simple fact is it doesn't need to. Overall, when this deck comes out in Maximum Crisis, it is reasonable to expect it to be competitive right out of the gate if it's given a fair chance. So, now we have arrived at number 1. Number 1. DINOMIST. Wow, did anyone really see this coming? Well, if you watched the last list, you probably had an inkling. I have said a lot over the course of various discussions and deck builds that Dinomists have a lot going for them. They are a pendulum deck, which gives them an existing inherent swarming advantage that, along with Odd Eyes, can deftly manage the detriments that will arrive with link summoning, without losing much efficiency. Floodgates that are common problems for Pendulum decks, like Anti-Spell Fragrance and Dimensional Barrier, are significantly less influential against Dinomists. Their level 4 and 5 Water Machine standing allow for a quality number of extra deck plays, including Metaphys Horus, Cyber Dragon Infinity, and number 37 Hope Woven Dragon Spider Shark, in addition to actively pushing the effect of Ragna Zero. All but one of the monsters have useful monster effects that produce impressive versatility and efficiency in the deck to either set up your own plays or counter your opponent's plays. The pendulum effects of Dinomists are heavily underrated in their ability to protect their fellow Dinomists in the monster zone from targeting effects and redirecting destruction effects, in a sense by sacrificing themselves, putting more pressure on the opponent to remove the threats that are actually on the field. Furthermore, Dinomist has a fantastic continuous spell in Charge that makes breaking their scales much more difficult and significantly augments the advantages of the pendulum protection effects, along with increasing offensive playmaking. Finally, when Dinomist Howling is released in Maximum Crisis, Dinomists get another significant power boost, taking them to that next level, providing even more consistency, versatility, and field control. The only real disadvantage of this deck is that it can be somewhat slow at times, and some may argue that, as a machine deck, it is vulnerable to System Down. But the way Dinomist should be played, System Down is not as detrimental for the deck as it is for other machine decks. Dinomists are a fantastic control deck that can do a lot to break boards and play around various opponent threats, and should be played as such. This deck, though, is also somewhat of an intuitive deck. It's not brainy per se, but it doesn't have a lot of basic paint-by-number combination play, so play experience with the deck does matter versus a deck like ABCs or Zodiacs, which largely centers around one or two big combo loops. Overall, I feel Dinomists are a diamond-in-the-rough deck that got lost in the shuffle, and the only real thing keeping it from achieving its full potential is player perception, especially after Dinomist Howling comes out. Well, that is my top 10 list of the best and most competitive Rogue decks for the current and coming format in the near future. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.